My husband and his brother thought it would be hilarious to leave me stranded at a desert gas station 480 miles from home. They laughed as their luxury SUV sped away, telling me to enjoy the walk. I did not walk home. I walked away, completely. 8 years later, when he saw me standing at his multi-million-dollar gala, his arrogant smirk vanished the second he realized who was standing right behind me. My name is Natalie, and I am 33 years old, but the defining moment of my life happened when I was 25. I was standing in the suffocating heat of a desolate Nevada desert, the blinding afternoon sun beating down on the cracked pavement of a rundown gas station. The heavy door of a black Cadillac Escalade slammed shut with a deafening thud that vibrated right through my bones. Through the lowered window, I could see the face of my husband Spencer. His features, which I had once loved, were twisted into an ugly, arrogant sneer. Beside him in the driver's seat was his older brother, Trent. Trent was slamming his hand against the leather steering wheel, throwing his head back in a fit of hysterical, mocking laughter. They were staring at me like I was the punchline to a pathetic, cruel joke. Spencer leaned out the window, his voice dripping with condescension. He told me I needed to learn how to be independent and that I could call him when I was finally ready to sign his paperwork. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a brutal betrayal from the exact people who promised to protect you. The massive engine roared to life, kicking up a thick cloud of dry dirt and sharp gravel that violently stung my bare legs. I stood frozen in disbelief. The heavy tires screeched against the burning asphalt as Trent floored the gas pedal, tearing out of the station. I watched the sleek black vehicle speed down the empty, shimmering highway. I kept waiting to see the brake lights flash. I kept waiting for them to turn around, assuming it was just another one of their twisted family pranks. But the lights never turned red. The car shrank into a tiny dark dot before disappearing completely over the horizon. The dead silence that followed was terrifying. I was 480 miles away from our secure community. I reached into the pocket of my thin denim shorts and pulled out my only lifeline. 12 crumpled dollars. My cell phone battery was completely dead. I had no jacket to survive the freezing desert night that was rapidly approaching. I was utterly abandoned. But as the initial wave of shock began to fade, the paralyzing fear in my chest was slowly replaced by a sharp, icy clarity. Spencer thought he was punishing me. He thought this humiliation would force me into submission. He had no idea that driving away was the single biggest mistake of his life. I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the thick stack of legal papers resting in the dry dirt. Just before the heavy vehicle had peeled out of the gas station, Spencer had shoved that document through the open window. He did not even hand it to me. He just let it drop, allowing the harsh desert wind to scatter the pages across the oil-stained concrete. It was a post-nuptial agreement. He had been relentlessly harassing me about it for months. Spencer and his arrogant family wanted me to sign away my entire 20% stake in their investment firm. Those shares were not something I asked for. They were legally gifted to me on our wedding day by his late father, the only man in that family who actually respected my intelligence and my background in financial auditing. Spencer had pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my face right before they abandoned me. His voice was sharp and devoid of any warmth. He explicitly told me he would not return to pick me up until I signed every single page and surrendered my equity back to him. He called it a necessary lesson in loyalty and obedience. He claimed a truly supportive wife would never hold his business assets hostage. But I knew the real truth. He wanted me out because I was the only person with the skills to notice the glaring discrepancies hidden deep within his recent financial reports. I knelt down slowly, feeling the sharp gravel dig into my bare knees, and began gathering the crisp white pages one by one. The desert wind was already picking up speed, and the temperature was plummeting at a terrifying rate. Without the sun, the Nevada landscape quickly turns into a freezing wasteland. I had dressed for a comfortable ride in a climate-controlled luxury vehicle. I was wearing a thin cotton summer dress and light sandals for what Spencer had promised would be a romantic weekend getaway. I had absolutely no jacket. I had no sweater. I did not even have a simple piece of fabric to wrap around my violently shivering shoulders. The vast sky above me began to shift from a bright, blinding orange to a deep, menacing shade of dark purple. The shadows cast by the rusted gas pumps stretched long and distorted across the cracked pavement. I looked down at the crumpled $12 clutched tightly in my cold hand. $12 was nothing. It would not buy a safe motel room. It would not buy a bus ticket back to civilization. It would barely buy me enough bottled water and stale food from the dingy convenience store to survive the night. I held the stack of legal documents against my chest, using the heavy paper to block the biting wind. A sickening realization washed over me. Spencer was not just throwing a temporary childish tantrum. This was a highly calculated ambush. He had deliberately driven me out to the middle of nowhere, isolated me from any potential help, and left me entirely exposed to the brutal elements. He wanted to break me down physically and mentally. He expected the fear and the freezing cold to force me into total submission. He fully believed I would trade my financial leverage just to beg for a warm ride home. I dragged my freezing legs toward the illuminated edge of the gas station canopy. There, bolted to a rusted metal pole, was an old payphone. It felt like a relic from another lifetime, but right now, it was my absolute only hope. My own cell phone was nothing but a useless brick of glass and metal in my pocket. Its battery completely drained during the long and silent drive. I frantically sorted through the $12 I had relieved to find a few quarters mixed in with the crumpled bills. My hands were shaking so violently from the rapidly dropping temperature that I dropped a coin twice before finally sliding it into the metal slot. I dialed the only phone number I had memorized other than my husband. It was Kendra. Kendra was the wife of Trent, a stunning and fiercely arrogant African-American woman who had always made it painfully clear that she considered me entirely beneath her. She came from massive real estate money and practically wore her superiority like an expensive designer coat. Despite our incredibly cold relationship, I foolishly thought that as another woman, she would never condone leaving a family member stranded in the freezing desert at night. I pressed the heavy plastic receiver to my ear and prayed for her to answer. The line rang 3 times before connecting. Immediately, a wave of loud bass and the sharp clinking of crystal glasses flooded my ear. She was at a party, a very expensive party, judging by the smooth live jazz music playing in the background. Kendra answered, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance. She had to shout slightly over the loud music. "Kendra, it is Natalie," I pleaded, my voice cracking from the dry wind and the sheer panic taking over my body. "Listen to me, please. Spencer and Trent left me at a gas station somewhere on the highway in Nevada. I have no car, my phone is completely dead, and it is freezing out here. You have to call them, tell them to turn around or send someone to come get me." There was a brief pause on the line. I actually heard the heavy ice in her glass clink as she took a slow, deliberate sip of her drink. Then a sharp, cruel laugh echoed through the receiver. It was a terrible sound that made my blood run much colder than the harsh desert air. "Oh, Natalie," Kendra sighed, her tone dripping with absolute venom. "You really thought you could play hardball with the family money and not get burned? You married Spencer for his bank account, sweetie. Did you honestly think you were an equal partner in this corporate empire?" "Kendra, please," I begged, hot tears finally welling in my eyes. "I am completely alone out here." "Then consider this a reality check," she snapped back, her voice turning totally ruthless. "You wanted a free ride. Well, the luxury ride is over. Walk home. It will help you lose some of that dead weight you have been carrying around." Before I could utter a single word in response, a sharp click echoed in my ear. The dead dial tone buzzed loudly against my frozen cheek. She had actually hung up on me. I stood there staring blankly at the plastic receiver, the horrifying reality of their coordinated cruelty finally sinking into my brain. I was not just abandoned by a temporarily angry husband, I was happily discarded by an entire family. The sun vanished completely, and the Nevada desert instantly transformed into a freezing, unforgiving nightmare. The temperature plummeted so fast that every breath I took felt like inhaling sharp shards of ice. I wrapped my arms tightly around my shivering body, rubbing my bare shoulders until my skin was raw, but it did nothing to stop the violent trembling. The sheer exhaustion of the day combined with the paralyzing panic of total abandonment began to weigh heavily on my physical body. I stumbled away from the payphone and pushed my way into the dimly lit, filthy restroom attached to the side of the gas station. It smelled strongly of cheap bleach and old rust, lit only by a single flickering fluorescent bulb that buzzed angrily above me. I locked the heavy metal door behind me and collapsed onto the cold, grimy tile floor. My legs simply refused to hold my weight any longer. I leaned my head against the cinder block wall, gasping for air, as a sudden sharp pain shot through my lower abdomen. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the extreme stress. I told myself it was just the freezing cold and the intense fear making my stomach cramp. But the pain did not fade. It intensified, twisting into an agonizing, tearing sensation that doubled me over on the hard floor. A suffocating wave of pure terror washed over me. I dragged myself up to the dirty porcelain sink, my hands gripping the edges so hard my knuckles turned completely white. When I looked down, my worst nightmare became an undeniable reality. I was bleeding. I was exactly 6 weeks pregnant. It was a secret I had been carrying silently for the past few days, waiting for the perfect moment to tell Spencer. I had foolishly imagined a romantic dinner where I would share the joyful news, hoping a child might soften his rigid, demanding nature. Now alone in a freezing, isolated bathroom, hundreds of miles away from any hospital or qualified doctor, I was losing our baby. The physical agony was blinding, but the emotional devastation was completely unbearable. I slid back down the wall, curling my body into a tight ball on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into my hands. Every agonizing cramp felt like a brutal reminder of my husband driving away laughing with his brother as he left me to suffer. He had abandoned me in the middle of nowhere to teach me a lesson about corporate obedience. Instead, his cruel power play was costing us the life of our unborn child. I lay there on that freezing floor for hours, battling the excruciating pain entirely alone. No one was coming to save me. My sister-in-law had mocked me. My husband had discarded me. As the physical trauma slowly began to subside, leaving me hollow and incredibly weak, a new feeling began to take root deep inside my chest. The terrified, heartbroken girl who had begged for help on that payphone died in that room. The harsh morning light filtered through the small frosted window of the gas station bathroom, pulling me out of a numb and dreamless sleep. My body ached in ways I had never experienced, and the cold tile beneath me offered no comfort. I slowly pushed myself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the dirty porcelain sink. I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My face was pale, my dress was ruined, and my eyes were completely devoid of the innocent hope that had lived there just yesterday. I splashed freezing water on my face, letting the sharp shock wash away the last remnants of my old self. Spencer wanted to break me. He wanted to strip away my dignity and force me to crawl back to his massive estate begging for his forgiveness. But the woman he married died in that room. I walked out into the blinding Nevada sunlight. The desert was completely silent. The scattered pages of the postnuptial agreement were still resting in the dust, exactly where the wind had left them the night before. I did not cry. The tears had completely dried up, replaced by an intense, burning focus. I walked over and calmly gathered the crisp white sheets of paper one by one. I reached into my small purse and pulled out a bright red ink pen. I sat down on the edge of the dusty concrete curb and flipped directly to page 3 of the financial disclosure addendum. Spencer and his arrogant legal team thought they were so incredibly clever. They assumed I was just a naive dependent wife who would blindly sign away her equity because the legal jargon looked too intimidating. What they conveniently forgot or perhaps completely underestimated was my actual profession. I was a senior forensic accountant. I spent my entire professional career tracking hidden assets, exposing corporate fraud, and dismantling complex financial structures for massive financial institutions. To the untrained eye, page 3 looked like a standard declaration of offshore equity holdings. But to me, it was a glaring, undeniable confession of federal tax evasion and massive money laundering. I uncapped my red pen and drew a thick, deliberate circle around a series of shell companies listed under a Cayman Islands registry. I traced the hidden money trail in the margins, connecting the fake vendor accounts, doing the complex math instantly in my head. Spencer was not just hiding money from me to secure his divorce. He was actively hiding hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government and his own investors. By trying to force me out of his company, he had basically handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire empire. I folded the heavily marked document and placed it carefully inside my purse like a loaded gun. I looked down the long, empty stretch of highway leading back to my old life. I made a silent, unbreakable vow right then and there. I was never going back to that house. I was never going to answer their calls or fight for a measly divorce settlement. I was going to disappear completely, build my own massive fortune, and wait for the absolute perfect moment to strike. They thought they left me with nothing, but they actually gave me everything I needed. 8 long years had passed. That is exactly how much time it took for the terrified, broken girl crying on a dirty bathroom floor to completely vanish. In her place stood the woman currently waiting outside the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the most powerful financial players in the country. This was not just a regular corporate gala. It was a massive, sickening celebration of absolute greed. Spencer and his family were throwing themselves a multi-million-dollar party to announce the upcoming initial public offering of their family investment fund. According to the glossy gold-lettered brochures scattered across the velvet-covered tables inside their financial empire, was officially valued at a staggering $500 million. Through the towering glass doors, I could see Spencer standing directly in the center of the lavish room. He looked older, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that undoubtedly cost more than what most working people made in an entire year. He held a crystal flute of imported champagne, laughing loudly as he entertained a tight circle of elite Wall Street bankers and powerful politicians. His older brother Trent was standing right beside him, nodding eagerly and aggressively, slapping the wealthy investors on the back. They looked so incredibly smug and self-satisfied. They looked entirely invincible. They genuinely believed they had successfully scammed their way to the absolute top of the American financial food chain without leaving a single trace behind. I stood quietly in the shadows, watching them raise their glasses to toast their own manufactured brilliance. They were completely unaware that the very foundation of their $500 million empire was built on a massive, fragile lie. For 8 long years, I had watched their every move from a distance. I had used my high-level position as a senior forensic accountant to quietly track every single suspicious wire transfer, every hidden offshore account, and every fraudulent tax return they ever filed. While they spent their days buying luxury yachts and boasting about their massive wealth on exclusive golf courses, I spent my nights meticulously building an airtight, undeniable federal case against them. The live string quartet played a lively symphony that echoed loudly through the grand marble hallways, completely masking the calm, steady rhythm of my breathing. I did not feel a single ounce of fear, panic, or hesitation. The Waldorf Astoria was currently filled with the wealthiest and most arrogant people in the city, but none of them knew the real truth. Spencer honestly thought he had discarded a useless dependent wife in the Nevada dirt all those years ago. He never imagined that the exact same woman had spent the last decade aggressively climbing the ranks of the most ruthless financial auditing firm in the world. He was expecting to take his fraudulent company public tomorrow morning and cash out hundreds of millions of dollars. But tonight there would be no victory. Tonight, the ghost from the desert was finally coming to collect everything. My attention shifted from Spencer to a loud, piercing laugh that cut sharply through the sophisticated hum of the ballroom. It was Kendra. She was parading through the sea of dark suits and elegant dresses like she was royalty holding court. She was dripping in excessive flashy designer labels that practically screamed new money. She wore a heavy emerald green gown covered in hand-stitched crystals paired with a massive diamond necklace that was honestly too large for the occasion. Every step she took was calculated to draw maximum attention to herself. I watched her corner a small group of conservative old money investors and their quiet wives. She was talking loudly, making wild dramatic gestures with her hands. Pinched tightly between her perfectly manicured fingers was a thick, solid metal credit card. It was an exclusive corporate black card issued directly from Spencer & Trent's investment firm, carrying absolutely no spending limit. She made sure every single person in earshot knew exactly what that piece of metal represented. She loudly bragged about how she had just used it to charter a private jet to Paris for a minor weekend shopping trip. She boasted about purchasing a third vacation mansion in the Hamptons and complained bitterly about how hard it was to find good domestic staff these days. She spoke to the wealthy wives with a sickeningly sweet tone that barely masked her deep underlying arrogance. She desperately wanted them to know that she was no longer just a regular citizen. She truly believed she was now at the absolute top of the American social hierarchy. A young, nervous waiter passed by her group carrying a silver tray of delicate appetizers. Kendra snapped her fingers right in his face, stopping him dead in his tracks. She looked down at him with an expression of pure disgust, criticizing the temperature of the food and demanding he bring her a fresh, perfectly chilled martini immediately. She treated the hotel staff like they were completely invisible unless she needed someone to belittle. It was the exact same cruel, dismissive behavior she had shown me on the phone 8 years ago when she told me to walk home in the freezing desert. She went on to describe the custom leather interior of her new luxury sports car, completely dominating the conversation while the older women just nodded politely. She was so blinded by her own reflection in the crystal mirrors that she never stopped to question where all this massive wealth was actually coming from. She loved the power that the money gave her. She worshipped the designer bags, the luxury cars, and the ability to look down on everyone else. But as I watched her wave that heavy black credit card in the air, a small, cold smile crept onto my face. She had absolutely no idea that her limitless wealth was entirely fake. She did not know that the corporate accounts funding her lavish lifestyle were currently under federal investigation. She was standing there laughing arrogantly, completely blind to the fact that her perfect world was about to be entirely destroyed. I gave a slight nod to the hotel staff guarding the massive mahogany doors of the ballroom. They gripped the heavy brass handles and pulled the doors wide open. The warm, golden light of the chandeliers washed over me as I stepped over the threshold. For the first time in 8 long years, I finally stepped out of the shadows and allowed myself to be fully seen by the people who had tried to destroy me. I was absolutely unrecognizable. I was no longer the fragile, terrified 25-year-old girl shivering in a cheap, ruined cotton sundress. Tonight, I was wearing a midnight black haute couture gown with razor-sharp asymmetrical cuts that draped perfectly across my figure. It was a masterpiece of European tailoring, specifically designed to exude pure, intimidating authority. Around my neck rested a single flawless diamond suspended on a delicate platinum chain. It was minimalist, but it carried the kind of quiet, devastating wealth that loud, desperate people like Kendra could never truly understand. My posture was perfectly straight, and my face was an impenetrable mask of absolute ice. My entrance did not cause an immediate dramatic hush across the entire hall. Instead, it was a slow, creeping wave of silence that rippled outward from the doorway. Elite guests instinctively turned their heads. Low whispers began to spread among the wealthy crowd. They could instinctively sense a massive shift in power, even if they did not know exactly who I was yet. I ignored all of them. I cut a straight visual path through the sea of expensive suits, until my eyes locked onto my target. Spencer was standing directly under the Grand Center chandelier. He was mid-sentence telling what was likely an incredibly arrogant story to his investors, his head thrown back in a booming laugh. He was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne high in the air, soaking in the absolute admiration of the powerful bankers surrounding him. As he slowly lowered his arm, his eyes casually swept across the room and finally landed on the entrance. He saw me. The arrogant, triumphant smile froze instantly on his face, twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. All the color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking completely hollow and sick. His brain clearly struggled to process the impossible reality standing right in front of him. His perfectly manicured fingers went entirely limp. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped from his hand and plummeted toward the polished marble floor. The sharp, violent crash of shattering glass echoed loudly over the elegant string music playing in the background. The wealthy men surrounding him jumped back in surprise as the expensive alcohol splashed across their polished shoes. Spencer did not apologize to them. He did not even look down at the mess he had made. He just stood there, completely paralyzed, staring at the woman he had discarded in the desert, who was now standing in his territory looking like an absolute queen. Spencer finally remembered how to breathe. He hastily kicked the jagged pieces of shattered crystal out of his way and took a slow step toward me. The initial panic in his eyes vanished quickly, replaced by the familiar mask of extreme arrogance. He slipped one hand casually into the pocket of his expensive tuxedo, desperately trying to project the image of a powerful man who was completely in control of the situation. He stopped just 2 feet away, invading my personal space. His gaze slowly dragged up from the hem of my black gown to the diamond resting against my collarbone. Then he let out a dry, condescending laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Well, good evening, Natalie," he said. He pitched his voice slightly louder than necessary, deliberately making sure the wealthy investors and corporate bankers surrounding him could hear every single humiliating word. What an incredibly dramatic entrance for someone so irrelevant. "I must admit, I never expected to see you standing in a room this exclusive. Tell me, did you blow through every last penny of that $50,000 divorce settlement just to rent that flashy dress? Did you really spend your entire life savings on a fake invitation just to get my attention one last time?" Trent stepped up right behind Spencer, crossing his heavy arms over his chest. He let out a crude snort, looking me up and down like I was a piece of trash that had somehow blown into the lobby. The elite crowd began to murmur, stepping back slightly to watch the spectacle unfold. Spencer soaked in the attention, his ego inflating with every second that passed. "So what exactly brings you to my celebration tonight?" Spencer continued, his tone dripping with absolute venom and superiority. "Please do not tell me you came all this way to beg for a job. Because if you are looking to wait tables and earn a few pathetic tips, you really should have used the service elevator in the back to find the hotel manager. Or maybe you are just here to beg for a charity handout from my company. If that is the case, you picked the absolutely wrong night. I am busy celebrating a $500 million public offering with the most powerful people in this city. I do not have a single second to waste on a desperate failure who cannot move on with her life." He laughed out loud, a booming sound meant to crush my spirit completely. 8 years ago, those exact words would have broken me. I would have run out of those doors completely blinded by hot tears of shame. But tonight I did not even blink. I stood as rigid as a stone statue, staring directly into his hollow eyes. I did not scream. I did not explain myself, and I did not show a single trace of anger. My absolute and terrifying silence caused the smug smile on his face to slowly stiffen. He thought he was publicly destroying a helpless ex-wife, completely unaware that he was eagerly digging his own financial grave in front of the entire world. The heavy, uncomfortable silence between Spencer and me was suddenly shattered by the sharp, aggressive clicking of high heels against the polished marble floor. Kendra pushed her way violently through the tight circle of wealthy investors, her heavy emerald green gown sweeping dramatically behind her. She planted herself right next to Spencer, crossing her arms and glaring at me with a look of absolute unrestrained disgust. She clearly could not stand the fact that the attention in the room had shifted away from her flashy diamonds and onto my quiet, unmoving presence. "Oh my goodness, Spencer!" she practically yelled, her shrill voice echoing harshly off the high ceilings. "Why are you even wasting your breath entertaining this pathetic woman?" Kendra leaned forward, her eyes scanning my black evening gown with exaggerated pity and blatant disrespect. She reached out a perfectly manicured hand, stopping her finger just an inch from the dark fabric of my bodice. "I know exactly what you are trying to do tonight, Natalie, but anyone in this room with actual money can tell that this dress is a cheap, embarrassing imitation. Did you buy this pathetic knockoff out of the back of a van just to sneak in here and pretend you belong in our world?" The elite guests standing nearby exchanged highly awkward glances, some whispering quietly behind their crystal champagne glasses. Kendra thrived on this kind of toxic drama. She fed on the twisted power of publicly humiliating someone she deemed socially and financially inferior, a cruel habit she had practiced on me for years. She turned her back to me slightly, addressing the elite crowd, like she was hosting a trashy reality television show. She loudly announced to the entire room that my mere presence was a severe insult to the incredible exclusivity of the evening. She made absolutely sure to project her shrill voice so every single billionaire corporate executive and politician could hear her vicious words clearly. "This is a highly restricted private event," Kendra announced, her tone dripping with absolute entitlement and fake superiority. "Every single chair at these dining tables costs $20,000. Let me repeat that for you, Natalie. $20,000 for one single seat. And you honestly think you can just waltz in here wearing a fake designer gown and stand among actual successful people? You are completely delusional." Completely. Kendra dramatically threw her hands in the air and spun around to face the perimeter of the grand ballroom. She began snapping her fingers violently at the hotel staff standing near the walls, treating them like obedient dogs. "Manager," she screamed, completely abandoning any remaining shred of high society elegance. "I need the general manager over here right this second. Security, we have a desperate broke trespasser who needs to be escorted out of the VIP section immediately." She looked back at me, a vicious, triumphant sneer spreading across her heavily made-up face. She truly believed she had just delivered the final fatal blow to my dignity. She thought she was calling the armed guards to throw out the garbage. She had absolutely no idea she was demanding the physical removal of the woman who held the financial keys to every single thing she owned. Kendra stood there breathing heavily, her chest heaving under her emerald green gown as she waited for the security team to drag me away. Her shrill voice had successfully summoned the general manager of the Waldorf Astoria, who was quickly approaching our circle with two large security guards trailing closely behind him. Kendra crossed her arms, a sickeningly triumphant smirk spreading across her face. But as the manager reached our group, he did not even look in her direction. He did not grab my arm. He did not ask to see my invitation. Instead, he stopped a polite distance away from me, offered a deep, highly respectful bow, and asked if everything was completely to my satisfaction. Kendra looked as if she had just been physically struck. Her mouth fell open in total shock as she watched the most senior staff member in the building treat me with absolute reverence. I did not acknowledge her confusion. I simply gave the manager a calm, professional smile. I told him the evening was proceeding perfectly, but that the guests at my current table seemed incredibly tense. I casually instructed him to bring out a bottle of the most expensive vintage champagne from their private reserve cellar, and I specifically told him to charge the thousands of dollars directly to my personal master account. The manager nodded immediately, promising to return with the bottle right away, before quietly backing away. Only then did I finally turn my attention back to Kendra. She was practically vibrating with a mixture of deep confusion and raw, boiling anger. Trent looked completely bewildered, while Spencer stared at me with his jaw tightly clenched. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. You are absolutely right about one thing, Kendra, I said, my voice smooth, steady, and projecting clearly across the suddenly quiet room. A single seat at these tables does indeed cost $20,000. It is a very impressive price tag. But you see, I did not buy a single seat, and I certainly did not need to forge an invitation or sneak in through the kitchen. I did not pay for a chair because I am the primary financial sponsor of this entire gala. Spencer let out a harsh, desperate bark of laughter, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He aggressively pointed a finger at my face, his voice shaking with forced bravado. Are you completely insane, Natalie? My investment fund paid for this entire ballroom. My company sponsored this event. You have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I tilted my head slightly, offering him a look of absolute, devastating pity. Oh, Spencer. I sighed softly. You really should pay much closer attention to your own accounting department. Your firm did not pay for this event. Your company has been completely insolvent and bleeding cash for over 6 months. The only reason this hotel did not cancel your lavish party last week is because Vanguard Financial stepped in and quietly covered your massive 7-figure deposit. And as the senior director of Vanguard, I am the one who personally signed the check that paid for the very floor you are standing on right now. The absolute silence that followed my announcement was deafening. The wealthy investors surrounding us, who had just been laughing at Spencer and his arrogant jokes, were now staring at him with a mixture of shock and deep suspicion. Spencer stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single coherent response. Trent looked violently ill, his heavy shoulders slumping forward as the horrifying reality of my words began to sink in. They were completely exposed. But I was not finished. I had waited 8 long years for this exact night, and I was going to dismantle their fake empire piece by piece. I slowly shifted my gaze away from my ex-husband and turned my attention back to his sister-in-law. Kendra was still standing there in her heavy emerald green gown, clutching her diamond necklace. The smug, triumphant sneer had entirely melted off her heavily contoured face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She clearly did not understand the complex corporate financial structures I had just exposed, but she understood the terrifying implication that the family money was suddenly in jeopardy. I offered her a very small, remarkably calm smile. It was the exact same condescending smile she had given me over the phone when she told me to walk home in the freezing Nevada desert. But let us not worry about Spencer and his massive corporate failures just yet, Kendra, I said smoothly, my voice projecting clearly into the quiet room. Let us talk about your fabulous, limitless wealth. You were speaking so loudly earlier about your private jet to Paris and your new luxury sports car. You were waving that exclusive corporate black card around for everyone to see. Kendra swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She instinctively pulled her hand back, trying to hide the heavy metal credit card inside the folds of her dress. It is actually quite funny, I continued, taking one slow step closer to her. While you were busy shouting at the general manager to have me thrown out of the VIP section, the bartender across the room was attempting to open a tab for that perfectly chilled martini you demanded. He tried to run your card, but it seems your limitless spending power just hit a very abrupt, embarrassing wall. Your black card was declined, Kendra. He tried to swipe it twice. That is a complete lie. Kendra shrieked, her voice cracking in pure desperation. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, realizing that the old money wives she had been trying to impress were now looking at her with absolute pity. It is a system error. The bank probably flagged it for fraud because I spend so much money. I did not argue with her. I simply tilted my head and suggested she check her mobile banking application. Kendra did not hesitate. Her hands were shaking violently as she frantically dug into her expensive designer clutch and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen with trembling fingers, her perfectly manicured nails clicking frantically against the glass. The entire room watched in breathless anticipation as the bright light of her screen illuminated her terrified face. She was about to see exactly what happens when you build your entire identity on stolen money. Kendra stared down at the glowing screen of her designer smartphone. The loading icon spun for what felt like an eternity before the mobile banking application finally refreshed. A bright glaring red banner instantly filled the top half of her screen. In bold white letters, the system displayed a single terrifying phrase: "Account frozen. Pending federal review." Kendra let out a sharp gasp, her perfectly manicured nails tapping frantically against the glass. She aggressively closed the application and reopened it, desperate to erase the nightmare unfolding in the palm of her hand. But the red banner remained. She swiped to her secondary checking accounts, the ones holding the funds for her extravagant shopping sprees and luxury vacations. Frozen. She checked her international savings accounts. Frozen. Every single line of credit, every single digital vault connected to her husband and his family business had been completely locked down by federal authorities. The heavy emerald green gown she wore suddenly seemed to weigh her down like a physical anchor. Her chest heaved violently as the reality of her sudden catastrophic poverty crashed into her mind. She had spent the last decade treating everyone around her like absolute garbage because she believed her wealth made her untouchable. Now she was standing in the middle of the most exclusive ballroom in New York City with absolutely nothing. "No," she shrieked. The sound tore through her throat, a raw, guttural scream of pure panic that completely shattered the sophisticated atmosphere of the gala. It was not a delicate gasp of surprise. It was an ugly, desperate wail that echoed loudly off the crystal chandeliers and the grand marble pillars. She frantically shook her phone in the air as if the device itself had somehow malfunctioned. "Trent," she screamed, spinning around to face her husband. Her flawless makeup was already beginning to smear as angry, terrified tears welled in her eyes. "Trent, fix this right now. Call the bank. Call the president of the bank. They locked everything. We have absolutely zero access to our money." The elite crowd of conservative investors and wealthy wives physically recoiled from her outburst. Just moments ago, Kendra had been holding court, bragging about her chartered jets and multiple mansions. Now she looked entirely unhinged. The wealthy women she had tried so hard to impress were now looking at her with undisguised contempt. In high society, losing your money was a tragedy, but losing your composure in public was the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Kendra had completely abandoned her carefully crafted image of superiority. She stomped her expensive heel against the marble floor, sobbing loudly and clutching her massive diamond necklace like a drowning woman holding on to a life raft. I stood there in complete silence, watching her entire world crumble into dust. The arrogant queen of the family had been violently dethroned, and she was doing the exact same thing she had mocked me for doing 8 years ago in the desert. She was having a complete mental breakdown in public. Trent pushed his way past the whispering guests, his heavy footsteps thudding loudly against the marble floor. He grabbed his wife by the shoulders, desperately trying to quiet her embarrassing shrieks, but Kendra was completely inconsolable. She shoved her glowing smartphone directly into his chest. Trent snatched the device, his eyes scanning the glaring red banner that declared their accounts were frozen under federal review. The blood drained from his face for a fraction of a second before rushing back in a violent, furious shade of purple. He did not look at his brother. He did not look at the wealthy investors who were now backing away from their family in disgust. Instead, he snapped his head up and locked his angry eyes directly on me. "You malicious little witch!" Trent roared, his deep voice booming over the soft classical music that was still playing in the background. He stormed toward me, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He stopped just inches from my face, his chest heaving with uncontrolled rage. "I know exactly what you did. You think you are so incredibly smart, Natalie. You think you can just hire some cheap internet hacker to infiltrate our banking network and lock our accounts for some pathetic petty revenge." He aggressively pointed a thick finger right between my eyes. "You are completely out of your mind if you think you can get away with this," he shouted, spitting his words with pure venom. "This is cyber-terrorism. You are intentionally sabotaging a multi-million-dollar financial institution the night before our public offering just because you are still bitter about a divorce that happened nearly a decade ago. I am going to call my legal team right now. I am going to drag you into federal court and sue you for every single penny you have ever made. I will make absolutely sure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a prison cell for this little stunt." The sheer ignorance of his accusations was almost laughable. Trent was a grown man who helped run an investment fund, yet he was standing in a room full of Wall Street elites, loudly claiming that a single disgruntled ex-wife had successfully hacked a major national banking system from her cell phone. The wealthy bankers standing nearby exchanged alarmed, highly critical looks. They knew exactly how the financial system worked. They knew that a federal hold was not a prank. It was the direct result of a serious criminal investigation. Trent was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to put me in my place that he could not see the massive federal trap closing tightly around his neck. I did not take a single step back. I looked at his furious, sweating face and let out a soft, amused sigh. "You really should save your empty legal threats, Trent," I replied smoothly, "because very soon you are going to need every single one of those expensive lawyers just to keep yourself out of federal prison." The tension in the grand ballroom had reached an absolute boiling point. The soft string quartet playing in the corner had completely stopped their music, and every single high-profile investor, Wall Street banker, and wealthy socialite was now staring directly at our standoff. The heavy, uncomfortable silence was broken only by Kendra quietly sobbing behind her husband. Spencer realized his massive, glittering celebration was rapidly turning into a public relations nightmare. He violently grabbed Trent by the arm and yanked him backward, stepping directly between his furious brother and me. Spencer forced a tight, highly unnatural smile onto his face. I could see small beads of cold sweat forming along his hairline, catching the bright light from the crystal chandeliers above us. He quickly smoothed down the lapels of his expensive custom tuxedo, desperately trying to project an aura of calm, unshakable authority. He turned his back to me slightly and raised both of his hands, addressing the murmuring crowd of elite financial backers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please accept my deepest apologies for this ridiculous and unfortunate interruption," Spencer announced, his voice booming with fake confidence. "I assure you there is absolutely no federal investigation happening here. What you are witnessing right now is nothing more than the tragic mental breakdown of my ex-wife. She has struggled with severe psychological issues and deep bitterness ever since our divorce nearly a decade ago." A few of the older conservative investors exchanged hesitant glances, clearly unsure of who to believe. Spencer saw their hesitation and immediately doubled down on his desperate lies. He puffed out his chest and pointed toward the massive gold banners hanging across the back of the room. "We are taking this firm public tomorrow morning," he declared proudly, making sure his voice echoed across the massive hall. "Our initial public offering is fully secured with a $500 million valuation. We have the absolute best legal and financial teams in the entire country backing this venture." Do you honestly believe a bitter, jealous woman who could not even handle a simple marriage could somehow outsmart Wall Street and freeze a corporate banking network? She is completely delusional. She likely fabricated a fake banking alert on a stolen phone just to scare my sister-in-law and derail our massive success. He turned back to face me, a vicious, triumphant sneer spreading across his sweating face. He truly believed his arrogant speech had successfully manipulated the room and saved his reputation. "You are not a senior director at Vanguard, Natalie," he hissed, leaning in close so only the people immediately surrounding us could hear his venom. "You are a pathetic, obsessive stalker who could never accept the fact that I built an incredible empire without you. You wanted to embarrass me tonight. But all you did was prove to the entire financial world that you are completely insane." Spencer crossed his arms, waiting for me to break down or run away in shame. He thought he had easily won the battle by leveraging his fake $500 million reputation against my word. He had absolutely no idea what I was about to do next. I stood perfectly still, letting his venomous words wash over me without flinching. Spencer was breathing heavily, his chest puffed out in a desperate display of false dominance. He truly believed he had won the argument by simply yelling the loudest. I slowly reached into my small black clutch and pulled out my smartphone. It was not a stolen device, nor was it the cheap burner phone he probably imagined. It was a secure corporate device issued directly by the Federal Compliance Division of Vanguard Financial. I looked down at the bright screen, my thumb hovering gently over a single digital application. Spencer laughed nervously, pointing at my hands. "What are you doing, Natalie?" He mocked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Are you going to call your imaginary hacker friends to come save you? You have absolutely zero power here. You are nothing but a pathetic ghost from my past." I did not bother to answer him. I simply pressed the button. Directly behind the raised platform where Spencer had been standing, a massive wall-to-wall LED screen dominated the entire stage. For the past 2 hours, it had proudly displayed the glowing gold logo of his investment fund. It was primed and ready to play a highly expensive, meticulously produced documentary video highlighting his fake rise to corporate dominance. The entire evening had been built around that upcoming presentation, designed to convince the investors to hand over their millions. The moment my finger tapped the screen of my phone, the glowing gold logo abruptly vanished. The sudden change in lighting plunged the immediate area of the stage into deep shadow for a fraction of a second. Then a sharp, loud electronic hum blasted through the state-of-the-art sound system, completely drowning out the soft classical music that had resumed playing in the corner. Every single head in the grand ballroom snapped toward the massive screen. Elite investors, wealthy wives, and even the hotel security guards froze in their tracks, their eyes locked on the stage. Spencer spun around furiously, his hands raised in the air as he shouted at the invisible audiovisual technicians hidden in the back control booth. He demanded they fix the technical glitch immediately. He thought someone had simply tripped over a power cord or pressed the wrong switch on a soundboard. But the technicians were not responsible for the sudden change. The entire visual feed had been completely overridden by the secure network I had legally tapped into hours ago. The giant screen flickered violently, flashing a bright, blinding white light across the faces of the terrified elite. When the image finally stabilized, it was not a tribute video. There was no sweeping orchestral music or dramatic voiceover praising his business acumen. Instead, the screen displayed a stark, high-resolution projection of an incredibly complex financial dashboard. The sheer scale of the projection made it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore or look away. Spencer stopped yelling at the technicians. His arms slowly dropped to his sides as he stared up at the massive screen, his jaw hanging open as the blood completely drained from his face for the second time that night. The projection on the massive wall was not just a simple spreadsheet. It was a sprawling, intricately designed web of financial transactions that I had spent the last 8 years meticulously mapping out. Every single line and every single node on that glowing diagram represented a piece of the massive fraud Spencer had built his entire life around. The wealthy investors in the room were not fools. They were seasoned financial experts, and the moment their eyes adjusted to the data displayed on the screen, a collective gasp swept through the elegant ballroom. Right in the dead center of the complex diagram was the official logo of Spencer & Trent's supposedly $500 million investment fund. But branching out from that central hub were 15 bright red lines connecting the main fund to 15 completely separate and heavily obscured offshore accounts. As I tapped the screen of my phone, the projection zoomed in, revealing the true nature of those accounts. They were shell companies, all registered to a single tiny post office box in the Cayman Islands. I began to walk slowly across the polished marble floor, my heels clicking sharply in the dead silence of the room. I did not need a microphone. My voice carried perfectly across the shocked crowd. I pointed up at the glowing red web. What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is not a successful American business. It is a highly sophisticated and completely illegal illusion. Spencer has spent the last 5 years taking your initial investments and secretly funneling them straight into these 15 phantom corporations. The investors stared at the screen, their faces turning pale as the terrifying reality set in. I swiped my finger across my device again, and the diagram animated the flow of money. It showed millions of dollars bouncing rapidly back and forth between the Cayman Islands and the main corporate accounts in New York. There is no actual revenue. I continued, my voice steady and completely void of any mercy. Spencer and Trent have been aggressively circulating the exact same pool of stolen money to artificially inflate their quarterly earnings. They use these shell companies to create fake vendor contracts, fake consulting fees, and fake overseas profits. They were actively trying to take this hollow shell of a company public tomorrow morning so they could cash out completely and leave all of you holding hundreds of millions of dollars in federal debt. The sophisticated and calm demeanor of the Wall Street elite completely shattered. Powerful men in expensive tuxedos began shouting over one another, pointing furiously at the undeniable evidence projected above them. They were looking at the exact wire transfer numbers, the exact dates, and the exact offshore registry codes. The data was airtight because I had pulled it directly from their own hidden internal servers. Trent stumbled backward, bumping into a cocktail table and sending more crystal glasses crashing to the floor. Spencer stood completely frozen under the blinding light of the massive screen, his entire manufactured reality collapsing into dust right in front of his eyes. I turned my back to Spencer, directing my full attention to the crowd of furious investors who were now hanging onto my every word. I raised my hand, pointing directly at the glowing red lines crisscrossing the massive screen above us. What you are looking at is a textbook example of round-trip transactions and synthetic revenue, I explained, letting my forensic accounting training take complete control of the room. Spencer and Trent did not build a $500 million investment fund. They built a highly mutated corporate Ponzi scheme. A loud murmur of absolute outrage rippled through the ballroom, but I raised my voice, cutting through the noise with cold, hard facts. Every single quarter, when they needed to show consistent growth to attract new capital from you, they would wire millions of your dollars into these offshore accounts. The Cayman entities would then immediately send the exact same money back to the main fund in New York, falsely labeling the transfers as consulting fees or massive returns on phantom equity. They were simply moving the exact same dollar back and forth across international borders to artificially double and triple their balance sheet. One of the lead bankers stepped forward from the crowd, his face flushed with intense anger. He demanded to know how their official auditing firm had possibly missed such a massive, glaring discrepancy. Because they completely fabricated their accounts receivable and colluded to hide the debt, I answered smoothly without missing a single beat. They used forged vendor contracts to secure massive high-interest lines of credit from secondary lenders. That borrowed debt is the real money they have been spending. That is exactly how Kendra bought her custom designer dresses, chartered private jets to Europe, and paid for multiple vacation mansions in the Hamptons. They were aggressively bleeding the corporate accounts dry to fund their arrogant, lavish lifestyle. Then they used your new investor capital to quietly pay off the minimum interest on their massive hidden loans to avoid defaulting. I swiped my secure device one more time, bringing up a glaring bright red negative number right in the center of the massive display. Their $500 million valuation is completely fictitious, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute authority. If you subtract the hidden liabilities, the unpaid offshore loans, and the completely fabricated equity, this company is not just broke. It is currently operating at a catastrophic deficit of over $300 million. They are entirely insolvent. The terrifying reality of their criminal plan finally dawned on the wealthy crowd. The initial public offering scheduled for tomorrow morning was never about expanding a successful business into a new market. It was a desperate, highly calculated exit strategy. Spencer and Trent planned to take the company public, sell their absolutely worthless shares to unsuspecting retail investors, and use that massive influx of public cash to wipe out their hidden debt. They were going to walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars in clean money, leaving every single person in this room holding the bag for a completely bankrupt, fraudulent empire. The entire room instantly erupted into pure chaos. For a few agonizing seconds, the grand ballroom was suspended in a state of absolute disbelief. Then the dam completely broke. The collective shock of the elite investors instantly morphed into a blind, furious panic. The room erupted into a deafening roar of shouting voices and frantic movement. Powerful men in tailored tuxedos who had just been clinking crystal champagne glasses with Spencer were now aggressively pushing their way toward the exit doors. Dozens of glowing smartphone screens lit up the dim room as the most prominent financial backers in New York simultaneously scrambled to call their private legal teams. I watched a highly influential real estate mogul, the exact same man who had been loudly praising Trent just an hour ago, slam his fist down on a glass cocktail table. He screamed into his phone furiously, ordering his wealth management team to immediately halt every single transaction tied to Spencer and his family. Older wealthy wives who had been eagerly listening to Kendra brag about her chartered jets were now rushing away from her as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. The horrific realization hit the elite crowd all at once. They finally understood that the expensive catering they were eating and the luxurious venue they were standing in were entirely funded by their own stolen capital. Spencer violently snapped out of his paralyzed state and lunged forward into the angry crowd. He desperately waved his arms in the air, attempting to block the furious investors from leaving his ruined celebration. He shouted over the incredible noise, begging them to stay and listen to him. He desperately promised he could explain the offshore accounts and swore that the complex data projected on the massive screen was entirely fabricated. But his frantic words were completely useless. His meticulously crafted charm had vanished, replaced by the pathetic, sweating desperation of a trapped criminal. No one was listening to his lies anymore. The wealthy bankers pushed right past him, shoving him aside like he was nothing but a minor obstacle in their desperate rush to save their massive fortunes. Trent had completely surrendered to the reality of the situation. He was slumped heavily against a thick marble pillar, his face buried deep in his hands. He fully realized that their lavish lives were officially over. He knew the furious investors dialing their high-powered lawyers would not stop until both brothers were entirely stripped of their assets. Kendra was still sobbing uncontrollably near the center of the room, but the elite crowd stepped right around her, completely ignoring her dramatic cries for help. The superficial social hierarchy she worshipped had turned on her in an instant. I remained standing perfectly still amidst the swirling chaos of the ballroom. I did not need to raise my voice or try to gloat over their destruction. I simply stood there and watched the inevitable violent collapse of the fraudulent empire they had built on my suffering. 8 years ago, they had laughed out loud as they drove away, leaving me completely isolated to freeze in the Nevada desert. Tonight, they were the ones who were completely abandoned, surrounded by a furious crowd of former allies who now wanted nothing more than to see them locked inside a federal prison cell. Spencer realized his carefully constructed empire was completely gone. The wealthy investors were no longer listening to him. The offshore money was trapped. The only thing he had left was his pure, unfiltered rage, and he directed it entirely at me. His face twisted into a mask of absolute hatred, the veins in his neck bulging violently against his tight tuxedo collar. He let out a raw, guttural roar that tore through his throat. He completely abandoned the fleeing crowd and locked his crazed, bloodshot eyes on me. "Security!" He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking under the immense strain. He frantically waved his arms toward the hotel staff who were standing frozen along the edges of the ballroom. "Get the director of security in here right this second. Grab this crazy woman and throw her out into the street. Arrest her for corporate espionage. Arrest her for trespassing." I want her physically dragged out of my building right now. He expected immediate obedience. He expected the uniformed guards to rush in and brutally tackle me to the floor. But the general manager, the exact same man who had bowed to me just moments earlier, did not move a single muscle. The hotel staff simply exchanged terrified glances and slowly backed away into the shadows. They knew exactly who had paid the massive invoice for the evening, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with Spencer and his sudden criminal exposure. When Spencer realized that no one was going to follow his desperate orders, he completely lost the last remaining shred of his sanity. He balled his hands into tight fists and began marching directly toward me. His chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths. He looked like a cornered animal preparing to strike. "You think you won, Natalie," he hissed, closing the final few feet of distance between us. "You think you can just walk in here, project some fake charts on a wall, and destroy my entire life? I will ruin you. I will tie you up in court for the rest of your miserable existence. I will make sure you never breathe a single breath of fresh air again." He raised his arm, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. He stepped so close I could smell the stale champagne and cold sweat radiating off his skin. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked onto his, completely unbothered by his pathetic threats. Right at that exact moment, a new sound began to echo from the grand marble hallway outside the ballroom. It was not the soft, hesitant shuffle of hotel security guards. It was the loud, synchronized, heavy thud of tactical boots striking the polished floors. The sound was incredibly intimidating, cutting straight through the chaotic noise of the panicked investors. The heavy footsteps were moving aggressively fast, and they were heading directly for the main entrance of our event. Spencer froze his raised hand, dropping slowly back to his side as he turned his head toward the massive mahogany doors. The room suddenly felt very small, and the people marching down that hallway were not here to help him. The massive mahogany doors at the main entrance did not just open. They were violently pushed apart, crashing loudly against the grand marble walls. The remaining investors who were scrambling to leave immediately stopped in their tracks, parting like the Red Sea to make way for the new arrivals. Spencer had been expecting a handful of poorly paid hotel security guards in cheap blazers. Instead, a highly organized team of men and women, dressed in sharp black suits and dark tactical gear, flooded into the elegant ballroom. The bright crystal chandeliers reflected off the heavy gold badges hanging securely around their necks. It was not hotel management. It was the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The chaotic noise inside the ballroom died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. The armed agents quickly fanned out across the perimeter, securing every single exit and blocking the frantic bankers from leaving the crime scene. Leading the federal raid was a tall, imposing man with piercing dark eyes and a completely unreadable expression. He was Special Agent Harrison, a veteran investigator from the White Collar Crime Division, and the man I had been secretly coordinating with for the past 18 months. He walked with the kind of absolute, unshakable authority that immediately commanded the entire room. But Agent Harrison was not walking alone. Right beside him, matching his confident, steady pace, was a man who commanded a completely different kind of power. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that made Spencer look like a cheap imitation of a businessman. His name was Donovan. He was a notoriously private, incredibly ruthless billionaire and the anonymous chairman of the Vanguard Financial Group. While Spencer desperately spent his entire life begging for attention in high society magazines, Donovan was the kind of man who actually owned the printing companies. He was the invisible hand that controlled billions of dollars in the global market, and he was the exact person who had quietly purchased all of the hidden debt Spencer and Trent had accumulated. The wealthy crowd practically held their breath as Donovan and Agent Harrison walked directly toward the center of the room. Spencer took a clumsy step backward, his previous rage evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror. He looked back and forth between the federal agents and the anonymous billionaire, his brain completely unable to comprehend how these two massive forces of power had suddenly appeared at his private celebration. Donovan did not even look at Spencer at first. He walked straight past the trembling man and came to a stop right beside me. He offered me a warm, deeply respectful smile that completely contrasted the freezing temperature of the room. Then he slowly turned his head to look at my ex-husband. The look of utter disgust on the face of Donovan was absolutely devastating. Spencer opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to demand an explanation or to offer another pathetic lie, but the words completely died in his throat. The Empire was officially dead, and the executioners had just arrived. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by a sound that made my skin crawl. It started as a low, breathy chuckle coming from deep inside Spencer. Within seconds, that chuckle morphed into a loud, echoing, completely maniacal laugh. He threw his head back, his shoulders shaking violently under his tailored tuxedo. The wealthy investors standing nearby physically recoiled, staring at him, as if he had just transformed into a terrifying monster. Spencer had officially snapped. His massive, fragile ego simply could not process the terrifying reality of his own destruction, so his brain aggressively rewrote the narrative to protect himself. He clapped his hands together, stepping toward Special Agent Harrison with a wide, deranged smile plastered across his sweating face. "Oh, thank goodness you are finally here," Spencer announced, his voice booming with a sickening level of false confidence. "I did not realize the hotel management actually called the federal authorities, but I am incredibly glad they did. You gentlemen arrived at the absolute perfect time to handle this completely ridiculous situation." Spencer aggressively thrust his finger through the air, pointing it directly at my face. He looked at the armed federal agents and then back to me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "Arrest her right now," he ordered, speaking to the veteran investigator as if he were commanding a lowly intern. "Arrest this woman immediately. She is a dangerous, disgruntled ex-wife who has spent the last decade obsessing over my incredible success. She just committed major corporate espionage and cyber terrorism against a $500 million financial institution." He paced back and forth across the marble floor, gesturing wildly toward the massive screen that was still brightly displaying his illegal offshore accounts. "She hacked into our highly secure private servers," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperate, manic energy. "She fabricated all of those ridiculous financial diagrams to defame my flawless character and completely sabotage our initial public offering tomorrow morning. Do you have any idea how much money I manage? I am a respected pillar of the New York financial community. This woman is a nobody who sneaked into my private gala just to throw a childish tantrum. She even locked my family banking accounts to cause a public panic. She is completely insane, and I demand you put her in federal handcuffs immediately." Trent and Kendra watched from the shadows in absolute horror. Even they realized that Spencer had completely lost his grip on reality. He was standing directly in front of the authorities with a mountain of undeniable digital evidence glowing brightly right behind him, and he honestly believed he could just lie his way out of it by playing the innocent victim. Spencer finally stopped his frantic pacing. He crossed his arms over his chest, a smug, deeply satisfied sneer returning to his face. He looked at Special Agent Harrison eagerly, waiting for the heavily armed team to rush forward and drag me out of the ballroom. He expected to watch me cry and beg for mercy. But nobody moved. The federal agents remained perfectly still, their hands resting calmly on their tactical belts. The deafening silence that followed his unhinged rant was the absolute final nail in his coffin. Donovan slowly stepped forward, breaking the suffocating silence that had fallen over the room. He closed the small gap between us, reaching out to wrap his arm firmly and protectively around my waist. He pulled me gently against his side in a clear, undeniable statement of unity and power. He looked directly at Spencer, and the expression on his face was one of absolute freezing contempt. Donovan did not look angry or out of control. He looked at my ex-husband the exact same way a person might look at a pathetic, diseased insect crawling across the floor right before stepping on it. Spencer swallowed hard, his arrogant sneer completely faltering as he stared at the notoriously ruthless billionaire. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to try and manipulate his way out of the situation one last time, but Donovan cut him off with a voice that was low, smooth, and dangerously calm. "You are not giving orders to anyone tonight." Spencer Donovan said, his words projecting effortlessly across the utterly silent ballroom. "You are certainly not giving orders to federal agents, and you are absolutely not speaking to my fiancé with that kind of disrespect ever again." The word fiancé echoed through the grand room like a physical blow. The wealthy investors who were still lingering near the exits gasped softly. Spencer looked as if he had just been struck in the chest with a sledgehammer. His bloodshot eyes darted from Donovan to the delicate diamond resting against my collarbone, finally realizing that the jewelry was not just a simple fashion statement. It was a heavily calculated engagement gift from one of the most powerful and wealthiest men in the world. But Donovan was not finished dismantling him. He tightened his grip slightly on my waist and looked out at the remaining crowd of elite bankers. "Allow me to formally introduce the woman you have been blindly insulting all evening," Donovan continued, his tone dripping with absolute authority. "Natalie is not just my future wife. She is the Senior Director of Forensic Accounting for Vanguard Financial. She is the brilliant mind who personally oversees our most complex corporate acquisitions and high-level fraud investigations." Spencer began to shake uncontrollably. The final terrifying puzzle pieces were violently slamming together inside his head. "While you were busy spending stolen money on cheap luxury items and patting yourself on the back," Donovan stated coldly, "Natalie was methodically tracking every single offshore wire transfer you ever made. She brought your entire fraudulent portfolio to my desk 18 months ago. She is the exact reason Vanguard quietly purchased all of your hidden secondary debt. We did not buy your debt to save you, Spencer. We bought your debt so we could legally open your books, hand your internal records directly to the federal government, and watch you completely destroy yourself on the eve of your public offering." Donovan looked down at Spencer with a final, devastating glare. "You threw away the smartest woman I have ever met because you were intimidated by her brilliance, and in doing so, you handed her the exact tools she needed to bury you." Spencer staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. He shook his head frantically, his mind desperately rejecting the monumental scale of his own failure. He pointed a violently trembling finger at Donovan, his voice reduced to a pathetic high-pitched whisper. "You cannot just buy my corporate debt without my knowledge. That is completely illegal. You have to disclose secondary market acquisitions to the board. My legal team will have this entire maneuver thrown out of federal court before sunrise." Donovan did not even blink at the empty threat. He calmly adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and looked at Spencer with absolute freezing pity. "I am not just an executive," Spencer Donovan stated, his voice resonating with undeniable power. "I am the chairman and majority shareholder of Vanguard Financial. We did not violate a single federal regulation because we did not buy your debt directly under our primary name. We used a highly complex network of 30 different anonymous holding companies to quietly purchase exactly 80% of your toxic liabilities over the past 4 years. We legally consolidated those massive holdings this very morning. As of right now, your fraudulent company owes my firm over $300 million, and we are officially calling in every single loan." I stepped out from under the protective arm of Donovan and walked right up to my ex-husband. I wanted to look directly into his terrified eyes as his entire manufactured reality finally collapsed. "Did you honestly believe you were a financial genius all these years, Spencer?" I asked, my voice steady, but laced with absolute poison. "Every single time your firm miraculously secured a massive high-risk loan to cover up your offshore money laundering, I was the one quietly approving the funds from the shadows. Every time you thought you successfully dodged a corporate audit, it was simply because I needed you to keep digging a much deeper hole. I spent 8 solid years meticulously weaving this net around you." I continued, ensuring every single word pierced his completely deflated ego. I watched you and Trent launder hundreds of millions of dollars. I let you buy the luxury cars, the private jets, and the extravagant mansions for Kendra. I gave you just enough financial rope to hang yourselves. If I had turned you in 8 years ago, you would have hired an expensive legal team and walked away with a minor fine. But I waited. I waited until your fraud crossed international borders. I waited until you foolishly attempted to defraud the American public with this massive stock offering. Special Agent Harrison finally took a deliberate step forward, pulling a thick stack of folded papers from the inside pocket of his dark tactical jacket. He unfolded the heavy documents, revealing a federal warrant stamped with the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. The meticulous financial trap I had spent nearly a decade building had just snapped completely shut. There were no hidden loopholes left. There was no amount of stolen money or high society influence that could possibly save them now. Spencer was no longer a wealthy investment banker. He was a trapped federal criminal standing right in the middle of a cage I had built specifically for him. Special Agent Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sheer weight of his presence and the heavy federal document in his hand commanded the absolute attention of every single person left in the grand ballroom. He took one deliberate step forward, closing the final gap between the federal government and the crumbling facade of my ex-husband. The heavy paper rustled loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. Spencer William Vance. Agent Harrison began, his voice completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy. It was the cold, mechanical tone of a man who took down arrogant criminals for a living. By the order of the United States Department of Justice, you are hereby placed under federal arrest. Spencer visibly flinched, as if the words themselves had physically struck him. He looked wildly over his shoulder, as if expecting to find a hidden exit or a team of expensive lawyers waiting to save him. But there was absolutely no one behind him except his equally terrified brother and a wall of heavily armed federal agents. Agent Harrison continued reading from the warrant, his eyes locked onto Spencer. You and your brother Trent Vance are being charged with multiple counts of first-degree securities fraud, international wire fraud, and the direct orchestration of a criminal money laundering enterprise. The federal indictment details the illegal concealment and illicit transfer of over $300 million through unauthorized offshore entities. The specific number echoed through the high ceilings of the Waldorf Astoria: $300 million. Hearing the exact amount spoken aloud by a federal investigator completely shattered any remaining doubt among the wealthy investors still watching from the perimeter of the room. This was not a minor accounting error. It was not a simple misunderstanding that could be settled with a discreet fine. This was a massive, historically significant financial crime, and Spencer was going to spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. Trent Vance, Agent Harrison said, shifting his piercing gaze to the older brother, who was still slumped heavily against the marble pillar. You are named as a primary co-conspirator in this federal indictment. Step away from the wall and place your hands visibly in front of you. 2 federal agents immediately detached from the perimeter wall and moved swiftly toward Trent. They did not ask politely. They grabbed his heavy arms, spun him around, and forced his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut cut through the silence like a gunshot. Trent did not resist. He simply let out a pathetic, defeated whimper as the agents patted down his expensive tuxedo for weapons or hidden phones. Spencer watched his older brother get aggressively detained, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He looked back at Agent Harrison, his mouth opening and closing, but absolutely no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable investment banker who had laughed at me in the freezing desert was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified man who finally realized that his money, his power, and his entire life were officially over. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists finally broke through the paralyzing shock holding Trent together. The terrifying reality of spending the next 20 years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary violently crashed into his mind. His heavy legs simply gave out. The two armed federal agents holding his arms had to brace their stances as Trent intentionally let his entire body weight drop toward the polished marble floor. He landed hard on his knees, tearing the fine fabric of his custom-tailored trousers against the cold stone. He looked up at Special Agent Harrison with wide, bloodshot eyes that were now rapidly filling with terrified tears. The aggressive, intimidating man who had confidently threatened to sue me into oblivion just half an hour ago was now sobbing hysterically like a frightened child. "It was not me," Trent screamed. His voice was shrill, desperate, and completely devoid of any human dignity. His frantic words echoed loudly across the silent ballroom, causing the remaining Wall Street elites to stare down at him in absolute, unfiltered disgust. I did not do any of this. It was all Spencer. Every single part of this massive fraud was entirely his idea. Spencer violently snapped his head toward his older brother, his jaw dropping in pure, unadulterated shock. "Trent, shut your mouth right this second," Spencer hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of deep fear and sudden rage. "Do not say another word to them." But Trent was far beyond reasoning. The primal selfish instinct of self-preservation had completely erased decades of deep familial loyalty in a matter of seconds. "I am just a glorified employee," Trent wailed, struggling weakly and pathetically against the firm grip of the federal agents. "I did not set up any of those illegal offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I do not even know the administrative passwords to the digital vaults. Spencer controlled every single wire transfer. He forced me to sign those forged vendor contracts. He told me if I did not play along with his scheme, he would cut me out of the family business and leave me with absolutely nothing. I was terrified of him. I am a victim here just like everyone else. The sheer cowardice radiating from the kneeling man was almost difficult to witness. He was eagerly throwing his own flesh and blood directly into the federal fire, desperately hoping the agents would show him mercy. He babbled uncontrollably loudly, offering to testify against his brother in federal court, promising to hand over his personal encrypted laptop, and begging the investigators for a leniency deal right there on the ballroom floor. Spencer looked as if he had just been physically stabbed in the back. The pale terror on his face instantly morphed into a mask of pure, violent fury. "You spineless, pathetic coward," Spencer roared. He tried to lunge at his kneeling brother, but a federal agent instantly shoved him backward by his chest. "You gladly spent millions of those stolen dollars to fund your lavish lifestyle. You signed every single fraudulent tax document right next to my name. Do not act like you are innocent now." The two brothers began screaming vicious, hateful insults at each other, violently tearing their own family apart, while the federal authorities watched in calm silence. The unbreakable bond they had always bragged about was completely gone, replaced by the ugly, desperate greed of two criminals turning on each other at the very end. The chaotic screaming match between the two brothers was suddenly interrupted by a frantic, pathetic movement near my feet. Kendra had been watching her husband betray his own blood from the shadows, her mind completely shattered by the sheer speed of their total destruction. The heavy emerald green gown that she had flaunted so proudly just an hour ago was now dragged across the polished marble floor. She dropped to her bare knees, completely abandoning any remaining illusion of high society elegance. She scrambled toward me like a desperate animal, her expensive high heels discarded somewhere in the panic. Before I could take a step back, her shaking hands reached out and aggressively grabbed the dark fabric of my dress. She clung to the hem of my gown as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling off the edge of the world. Her perfectly contoured makeup was completely ruined, smeared across her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks of black mascara. She looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, her chest heaving as she gasped for air between her loud, dramatic sobs. "Please, Natalie." "Kendra," wailed her shrill voice, breaking violently. "Please do not do this to us. You cannot just take everything away and throw us out into the street. We have absolutely nothing left." She squeezed the fabric of my dress tighter, her knuckles turning completely white. She looked up past me, her terrified eyes darting toward Donovan before locking back onto my face. She desperately tried to summon a look of deep affection, a sickeningly fake expression that completely failed to hide her raw panic. "You have to tell him to stop!" Kendra begged, tears dripping from her chin onto the marble floor. "Tell Donovan to withdraw the federal complaints. Tell him to unfreeze our accounts and let us walk away. We are family, Natalie. You and I used to be sisters. We shared so many memories together. You know deep down in your heart that we do not deserve to be destroyed like this. Please just give us a chance to survive. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Show us a little bit of mercy for the sake of the family we used to be." The sheer audacity of her words was absolutely breathtaking. The wealthy investors who were still standing near the exit doors stared at the weeping woman in total disgust. Kendra was actually trying to weaponize the concept of family against the exact same woman she had completely abandoned 8 years ago. She honestly believed that a few desperate tears and a fake apology could instantly erase a decade of profound cruelty. She was begging for a lifeline from the very person she had proudly pushed into the freezing desert. I looked down at her shaking hands gripping my dress, and I did not feel a single drop of pity. I stared down at the desperate woman weeping at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I slowly reached down, my hands moving with deliberate freezing precision. I grabbed Kendra by the wrists and forcibly peeled her shaking fingers off the dark fabric of my gown. I pushed her hands away and took a deliberate step backward, completely severing the physical connection between us as if she were a highly toxic substance. Kendra collapsed forward, her palms hitting the cold marble floor as she stared up at me in absolute shock. "Family." I repeated the word slowly, letting it echo harshly across the silent ballroom. "You actually have the nerve to stand here and talk to me about family. Let us take a quick trip down memory lane, Kendra. 8 long years ago, I called your personal cell phone from a filthy payphone in the middle of the Nevada desert. I was completely stranded in the freezing cold, absolutely terrified, and begging for a tiny shred of human decency. Do you remember exactly what you said to me?" Kendra squeezed her eyes shut, but I refused to let her hide from her own cruelty. I did not wait for her to answer. "You laughed at me," I stated, my voice ringing with crystal clear authority. "You told me I was a pathetic, dependent liability. You told me to start walking because my existence was no longer your problem. You proudly participated in my destruction, and now you want me to save you. There is absolutely no mercy left for you here." I turned my back on her and shifted my gaze directly to Spencer. He had stopped shouting at his handcuffed brother and was now staring at me, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked like a cornered rat waiting for the final strike. "And you, Spencer," I continued, my voice dropping into a low, deadly register that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "You left me in the dirt at that isolated gas station with exactly $50 to my name. You drove away in your luxury car completely convinced you had cleanly disposed of a useless burden so you could go build this fake empire. But you made one massive fatal miscalculation. You did not just abandon a wife that night, you threw away your own blood." Spencer stopped breathing. His bloodshot eyes widened in sudden horrifying comprehension. The arrogant facade he had worn for a decade completely shattered in an instant. "I was pregnant, Spencer," I declared, stripping every last drop of emotion from my words so they hit him like a physical blade. "I was carrying your child. When you left me in that freezing desert, the immense physical trauma and the sheer terror of abandonment were simply too much for my body to handle. I collapsed on the concrete floor of a dirty bathroom, and right there, entirely alone in the dark, the heart of your unborn child stopped beating forever." The silence that instantly slammed into the grand ballroom was absolute crushing and entirely suffocating. It was a heavy physical weight that pressed down on the wealthy investors, the hotel staff, and the armed federal agents. No one dared to move a single muscle. No one dared to take a breath. Even Kendra had completely stopped her pathetic sobbing, her hands covering her mouth in pure, unadulterated horror. Spencer stood completely paralyzed, his jaw hanging slack as his mind violently imploded under the catastrophic, unforgivable weight of his own monstrous actions. The devastating truth hit Spencer with the destructive force of a massive freight train. The arrogant sneer, the fake confidence, and the desperate bravado he had wielded like a shield for the last decade were completely obliterated in a single heartbeat. His mind frantically tried to reject the terrifying reality of my words, but the absolute certainty in my voice left him with no room for denial. He opened his mouth desperately trying to form a coherent sentence, a pathetic apology, or even a simple denial, but his vocal cords completely failed him. All the remaining strength instantly vanished from his legs. Spencer William Vance, the self-proclaimed financial genius of New York, slowly collapsed. His knees hit the polished marble floor with a dull, sickening thud. He did not brace himself. He did not look around to his wealthy friends for help. He just stared blankly at the ground, his eyes completely hollowed out by the agonizing weight of his own monstrous cruelty. He had spent 8 years building a fraudulent empire to prove he was an untouchable king among men, only to finally realize he had murdered his own legacy in a filthy gas station bathroom. Special Agent Harrison did not allow the heavy, suffocating silence to linger any longer. He stepped forward with mechanical, unforgiving precision. He grabbed Spencer by the shoulders, roughly turning the broken man around. Spencer offered absolutely zero physical resistance. He was essentially a hollow shell trapped inside an incredibly expensive tuxedo. Agent Harrison pulled his arms firmly behind his back, and the sharp metallic ratcheting of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed like a final gavel strike across the grand ballroom. The freezing metal locked tightly around his wrists, permanently binding the fake billionaire to the devastating consequences of his criminal actions. Right at that exact moment, the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance burst open once again. This time it was not the federal authorities. It was a massive, aggressive swarm of financial journalists, investigative reporters, and press photographers. I had personally ensured that every major news outlet in the city received a highly detailed anonymous tip about the federal raid exactly 30 minutes ago. A blinding storm of bright white camera flashes instantly erupted, illuminating the chaotic scene in rapid, relentless bursts of harsh light. The aggressive clicking of camera shutters sounded like a swarm of angry locusts descending upon the ruined gala. The press captured every single pathetic detail of their downfall. They photographed Trent sobbing uncontrollably in his tight steel handcuffs. They captured Kendra kneeling barefoot on the floor in her ruined designer gown, hiding her face from the lenses. And most importantly, they immortalized the exact moment Spencer was dragged to his feet by the armed federal agents, his face pale and completely devoid of any human soul. The $500 million empire was officially dead, captured in high definition for the entire world to see. The lavish decorations, the crystal chandeliers, and the vintage champagne meant absolutely nothing now. I turned my back to the blinding camera flashes, slipped my hand securely into Donovan's arm, and walked out of the Waldorf Astoria without looking back a single time. The ghost from the desert had finally finished her work. 6 exact months had vanished since the blinding camera flashes illuminated the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. The opulent crystal chandeliers and the intoxicating scent of expensive vintage champagne had been permanently replaced by the sterile, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. The room was a massive chamber of dark mahogany and cold polished stone. It was a place designed specifically to strip away every illusion of power and reduce arrogant men to absolute nothingness. I sat quietly in the second row of the heavy wooden gallery benches. Donovan sat directly beside me, his steady presence a grounding force in the massive, echoing room. We did not speak. We simply watched the two men sitting at the defense table waiting for the final chapter of their miserable lives to be written into the public record. Spencer and Trent Vance looked completely unrecognizable. The custom-tailored tuxedos and the smug, invincible sneers were entirely gone. After spending 6 grueling months in a maximum security federal holding facility while awaiting their trial, the severe physical and psychological toll was vividly painted across their faces. Trent had lost a massive amount of weight, his cheap, ill-fitting gray suit hanging loosely off his trembling frame. He kept his head bowed, his hands clasped so tightly on the wooden table that his knuckles were stark white. Spencer sat completely rigid next to him. His hair was visibly thinning and heavily grayed at the temples. His skin possessed a sickly, translucent pallor. He stared blankly at the dark wood of the judge bench, his eyes entirely hollowed out. He looked exactly like a man who had already died, but had not yet been buried. The heavy oak door behind the bench swung open, and the entire courtroom immediately rose to its feet. The federal judge, a stern woman with decades of experience dismantling corporate criminals, took her seat. She did not waste a single second on pleasantries. She looked down at the two brothers with a gaze so intensely cold it seemed to drop the temperature of the entire room. She began to read the final summary of the federal indictment, her voice projecting with absolute devastating clarity. She systematically dismantled their entire fake empire out loud for the public record. She detailed the $300 million deficit. She listed the 15 phantom shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. She spoke of the forged vendor contracts, the synthetic revenue streams, and the massive illegal loans they had secured under false pretenses. Every single word she spoke was an undeniable confirmation of the meticulous forensic accounting trap I had built over the last 8 years. The judge then shifted her focus to the financial restitution. She declared that the Vance Family Investment Fund was officially dissolved. By federal decree, every single asset tied to their names, their corporate entities, and their spouses was subject to immediate, absolute seizure. She methodically listed the properties being liquidated: the massive vacation mansions in the Hamptons, the fleet of imported luxury sports cars, the chartered private jets. Even the extravagant diamond jewelry and the contents of their personal bank accounts were completely stripped away. The judge legally transferred the entirety of their liquidated estate directly to Vanguard Financial to begin covering the massive mountain of secondary debt my firm had acquired. In a matter of minutes, the court legally erased every single penny they had ever stolen. They were not just bankrupt, they were completely financially annihilated. Spencer did not react to the loss of his mansions or his cars. He just kept staring straight ahead, completely numb to the financial slaughter. He knew the money was already gone. He was only waiting for the final swing of the axe. The judge leaned forward, clasping her hands on top of the heavy legal documents. Spencer William Vance and Trent Robert Vance, she announced, her voice echoing off the high stone walls. You built an empire entirely on a foundation of profound deceit, staggering arrogance, and the blatant theft of hundreds of millions of dollars from unsuspecting investors. You orchestrated one of the most brazen corporate money laundering schemes in recent history. Your actions demonstrate a complete and utter lack of remorse or moral compass. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. It is the judgment of this federal court that you both be remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Bureau of Prisons. You are hereby sentenced to serve 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge paused, ensuring her final words would ring in their ears for the rest of their lives. Due to the severe, premeditated nature of your financial crimes, this sentence is to be served in its entirety. There will be absolutely no possibility of early release. There will be no parole. You are entirely dismissed. The sharp, violent crack of the wooden gavel slamming against the sounding block echoed like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. It was the exact sound of an 8-year nightmare officially coming to an end. Trent instantly collapsed forward onto the defense table, burying his face in his arms as he wailed in absolute agony. The harsh reality of spending the next 15 years locked inside a concrete cell completely broke his fragile mind. Spencer did not cry. 2 heavy-set federal bailiffs immediately stepped up behind him, gripping his arms to pull him to his feet. As they forced his hands behind his back to secure the heavy steel transport chains around his waist, Spencer finally turned his head. He looked over his shoulder, his dead, hollow eyes scanning the gallery until they locked directly onto mine. There was no anger left in his gaze. There was no hatred, no arrogance, and no defiance. There was only a terrifying empty void. He looked at me, the woman he had discarded in the freezing desert, the woman who had meticulously orchestrated his absolute destruction, and he finally understood the true cost of his actions. He was going to spend the next 5,000 days locked inside a metal cage, completely stripped of his name, his wealth, and his freedom, with nothing but the haunting memory of the child he had killed to keep him company. I held his gaze without blinking, my face a mask of pure, unbreakable ice, until the bailiffs forcibly turned him around and marched him out through the heavy side door. While Spencer and Trent traded their custom-tailored tuxedos for standard-issue federal prison uniforms, the devastating ripple effect of their 15-year sentences violently consumed the rest of the family. The sweeping federal court order did not just seize the corporate assets and the offshore banking accounts. It aggressively liquidated every single aspect of their fraudulent lives, tearing down the lavish illusions they had built over the last decade. The massive Vanguard debt had to be repaid, and the government was absolutely ruthless in its collection. 2 weeks after the final gavel struck in the courtroom, a team of federal marshals and bank auditors stood in the grand marble foyer of the Manhattan penthouse that Kendra had spent millions decorating. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park offered her absolutely no comfort today. Every single item of value in the massive apartment was tagged with bright red federal seizure stickers. The custom Italian furniture, the imported artwork, and even the massive walk-in closets filled with heavy designer gowns were all legally confiscated by the government. Kendra was allowed to take only her most basic personal necessities. Her matching sets of luxury leather luggage had been seized for auction, leaving her to pack her few remaining plain garments into a scuffed, faded canvas suitcase she had found buried in the back of a utility closet. She wore cheap gray sweatpants and a faded cotton shirt, completely stripped of her heavy diamond necklaces and her emerald green dresses. The federal marshals watched her with cold, professional indifference as she dragged the heavy canvas bag across the polished hardwood floor. The broken wheels of the suitcase squeaked in a pathetic, rhythmic whine that echoed loudly through the empty, cavernous rooms she used to rule. When she finally stepped out into the hallway, the heavy oak door of the penthouse slammed shut behind her. The sharp, metallic click of the deadbolt, locking her out of her own life, sounded incredibly final. She dragged her broken suitcase into the elevator and rode down to the lobby. The hotel concierge, a man she used to aggressively snap her fingers at and treat like a peasant, did not even look up from his desk as she walked out the front glass doors. She was no longer a VIP guest. She was just another broke, evicted citizen, blending into the crowded sidewalks of New York City. Fast forward a few agonizing weeks. The brutal reality of having absolutely zero money and no marketable job skills quickly caught up with her. The woman who once bragged loudly at high society galas about chartering private jets to Paris and carelessly waving a limitless corporate black card was now facing the terrifying prospect of true poverty. She had exhausted the tiny amount of emergency cash she had hidden away, and her wealthy socialite friends had completely blocked her phone number the minute the FBI raided the Waldorf Astoria. She was entirely isolated. On a freezing Tuesday morning, Kendra found herself standing under the flickering, harsh fluorescent lights of a crowded city social welfare office. The room smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and the exhausted sighs of desperate people trying to survive. Kendra stood near the back of a massive winding line, clutching a crinkled manila folder filled with government application forms. She was there to apply for federal food stamps just so she could afford to buy basic groceries. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails had long since broken off, leaving her fingers raw and unpolished. Her professionally styled hair was tied back in a messy, greasy knot. She kept her head down, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor, deeply terrified that someone from her former high society circles might somehow walk by and recognize her in this miserable place. Every single step she took forward in that slow-moving welfare line was a crushing, humiliating blow to her massive ego. She looked at the paperwork in her trembling hands. She had been forced to fill out forms detailing her absolute financial ruin. Under the section labeled Total Monthly Household Income, she had written a giant, humiliating 0. She was entirely dependent on the exact same government welfare system she used to loudly mock at her exclusive dinner parties. The woman standing directly in front of her was a tired, overworked mother holding a crying toddler. Years ago, Kendra would have looked at this woman with pure disgust and demanded a manager remove her from the room. But today, they were exactly the same. In fact, the exhausted mother was likely far better off because she had not built her entire identity on a mountain of stolen money and vicious lies. When Kendra finally reached the front of the line, she had to slide her crinkled paperwork under a thick pane of scratched bulletproof glass. The bored city worker on the other side did not offer her a polite bow. He did not ask if the temperature of the room was to her liking, and he certainly did not offer her a glass of vintage champagne. He simply glanced over her application, stamped her forms with heavy red ink, and handed her a basic green plastic electronic benefits card. Kendra stared down at the cheap piece of plastic resting in her shaking palm. It was not a heavy metal, limitless black card. It commanded absolutely no respect. It was a heavily restricted government ration card that tightly controlled exactly what kind of generic low-cost food she was allowed to put into her body. It was the ultimate, undeniable symbol of her complete downfall. She slowly walked out of the welfare office and stepped back onto the busy, unforgiving concrete sidewalks. The freezing city wind whipped harshly against her face. She had no luxury sports car waiting at the curb with a custom leather interior. She had no hired driver to open the door for her. She had to walk 3 miles in the freezing cold back to the tiny, cramped basement apartment she was currently renting by the week in the worst part of the city. She gripped the plastic food stamp card tightly in her coat pocket, completely broken, entirely alone, and permanently exiled to the freezing desert of her own making. High above the freezing concrete sidewalks, where Kendra now dragged her broken shoes, the air was perfectly still. The 80th floor of the Vanguard Financial Headquarters was a sanctuary of absolute, unshakable power. Massive floor-to-ceiling glass panels wrapped around the entire executive suite, offering an unobstructed, breathtaking panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. Down below, the endless streams of yellow cabs and black luxury vehicles looked like tiny, insignificant mechanical toys crawling through the deep concrete canyons of the city. The chaotic, deafening noise of the streets was completely silenced behind the thick, soundproof glass. I stood quietly by the window watching the afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the towering skyscrapers. I was no longer wearing the intimidating black haute couture gown from the gala. Today I wore a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal executive suit. I did not need heavy makeup or flashy designer labels to prove my worth. I held a simple crystal glass of sparkling water, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips. 8 years of intense burning focus had finally culminated in this exact moment of pure, uninterrupted tranquility. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest since that horrifying night in the Nevada desert was entirely gone. It had been completely replaced by a profound sense of peace. The soft, steady rhythm of leather shoes stepping across the polished mahogany floor broke my silent reflection. Donovan walked across the massive office and came to a stop right beside me. He did not speak immediately. He just slipped his hands into the pockets of his dark trousers and looked out at the sprawling financial empire we effectively ruled together. His presence was an incredibly comforting anchor, radiating the kind of quiet, absolute authority that Spencer had spent his entire life desperately trying to fake. "We executed it perfectly," Donovan finally said, his deep voice a low, soothing rumble that perfectly matched the calm atmosphere of the room. "Not a single loose end. The federal asset forfeiture was completed this morning. The Vance Family Investment Fund has been entirely erased from the state registry. They are officially ghosts." I took a slow sip of my water and nodded. We did not need to lower ourselves to their pathetic level to achieve this victory. There were no trashy public screaming matches. There were no violent physical altercations, and there were absolutely no crude emotional insults exchanged in the mud. Spencer, Trent, and Kendra operated on loud, aggressive arrogance. They genuinely believed that whoever shouted the loudest and wore the most expensive clothes held the most power. But Donovan and I knew the real truth about how the world actually worked. True, devastating power is completely silent. It does not need to boast or beg for attention. Our victory was built on meticulous data, unbreakable patience, and the cold, hard reality of mathematics. We fought a massive war of intellect, and we executed our strategy with the flawless precision of a master surgeon. I had taken my deepest, most agonizing trauma and systematically forged it into an unstoppable weapon. I did not seek petty revenge by slashing tires or ruining a social event. I had patiently dismantled the very foundation of their existence, using the exact same financial system they arrogantly thought they had mastered. I beat them at their own game on their own board, and I did it without breaking a single law. Donovan reached out and gently took my free hand. His grip was firm, grounding, and incredibly warm. I looked up at him, studying the sharp lines of his face. He did not save me from the desert 8 years ago. I had saved myself. I had clawed my way up from the dirt, educated myself through sleepless nights, and built my own impenetrable armor. Donovan simply recognized a fellow apex predator in the corporate wilderness and chose to stand beside me. Our partnership was not built on the fragile, toxic dependency that Spencer had always demanded from me. Our bond was forged in deep mutual respect, shared brilliance, and an undeniable, powerful love that required absolutely no validation from the outside world. I turned my attention back to the massive glass window. Somewhere far below us, locked inside a concrete and steel federal penitentiary, Spencer was beginning the first year of his agonizing 15-year sentence. He would spend the next 5,000 days staring at gray walls completely stripped of his name, his wealth, and his freedom. Somewhere else in the freezing city, Kendra was likely standing in another endless welfare line, tightly clutching her government ration card. They were exactly where they deserved to be. But I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of the financial world. The terrified, broken 25-year-old girl crying on a dirty bathroom floor was a distant, faded memory. The ghost from the desert was officially laid to rest. I took a slow, deep breath of the perfectly conditioned air, leaned my head against the strong shoulder of my future husband, and smiled confidently at the horizon. The long, grueling war was officially over, and the absolute best part of my life was just beginning. The golden hour sunlight began to shift across the massive glass panels of the 80th floor. It bathed the entire executive suite in a rich, warm glow that stood in stark contrast to the freezing winter winds whipping through the concrete canyons of Manhattan far below us. I kept my head resting gently against the solid, unyielding shoulder of Donovan. For a long time, we simply existed in that perfect, unbroken silence. The massive financial war we had just won felt like a distant storm that had finally exhausted its fury, leaving behind nothing but clear skies and calm waters. Donovan slowly shifted his weight. He released his firm grip on my hand and took the crystal glass of sparkling water from my fingers. He reached over to the polished mahogany desk beside us and set the glass down with a soft clink. Then he stepped slightly behind me, wrapping his strong arms securely around my waist. He pulled my back flush against his chest, enveloping me entirely in his warmth and protection. Slowly, deliberately, he slid his right hand down the front of my tailored charcoal suit and rested his palm flat against my lower stomach. The gesture was incredibly gentle, yet it carried a weight that completely redefined my entire existence. I closed my eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. I placed my own hands delicately over his, lacing my fingers through his as a profound wave of absolute peace washed over my soul. 8 years ago, I had been brutally stripped of the most precious thing a woman could carry. I had spent countless nights waking up in cold sweats, my mind relentlessly dragging me back to the filthy, freezing concrete floor of that isolated Nevada gas station bathroom. For a very long time, I honestly believed that Spencer had not just killed my unborn child that night, but that he had permanently destroyed my physical and emotional capacity to ever become a mother again. I thought my body had become a barren wasteland, completely poisoned by the trauma, the grief, and the consuming desire for absolute justice. But standing here now, wrapped in the arms of a man who loved me with a fierce, unconditional devotion, I knew the ultimate truth. I was not broken. The deep, agonizing wounds of the past had not just scarred over, they had entirely healed. Beneath the warm, steady pressure of the hand of Donovan, a brand new life was quietly taking shape. It was a tiny, fragile heartbeat that represented the absolute and final defeat of every single person who had ever tried to destroy me. I opened my eyes and looked down at our intertwined hands resting over my womb. A soft, radiant smile broke across my face. It was not the cold, calculated smirk I had given Spencer in the ballroom. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. This new life growing inside of me was the ultimate symbol of my complete rebirth. Spencer had spent his entire life obsessing over fake wealth and manufacturing a fraudulent legacy that ultimately ended in a federal prison cell. Meanwhile, I was quietly cultivating the only kind of legacy that actually mattered. I was bringing real, undeniable life into a world that I had personally fought to make safe. "Our child is going to have the entire world," Donovan whispered softly, his deep voice vibrating gently against my back. His breath was warm against my ear as he spoke into the quiet sanctuary of our office. "And they will never know a single day of fear. They will never know what it feels like to be abandoned or betrayed or left out in the cold. I will burn down this entire city before I ever let anything hurt the two of you." I leaned back against his chest, completely surrendering to the absolute security of his promise. "I know you will," I replied, my voice steady and thick with emotion. "But they will not need you to burn the city down, Donovan. Because we are going to teach them how to own it. We are going to teach them how to build an empire on truth, intellect, and unbreakable resilience. We are going to raise a titan." The profound poetry of the moment was not lost on me. The Vanguard financial empire, built on exposing corporate corruption and dismantling fraudulent predators, would eventually be passed down to the very child who represented my triumph over those exact evils. My past was no longer a heavy anchor dragging me down into the dark. It had simply become the foundational bedrock upon which I was building my brilliant future. Every tear I had shed in the desert, every grueling hour I had spent studying forensic accounting in a cramped apartment, and every cold calculation I had made to trap Spencer, had all led me to this exact, perfect reality. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the Manhattan skyline in vibrant shades of deep purple and brilliant gold. The city lights began to flicker on millions of tiny electric stars, waking up across the sprawling metropolis below. I stood at the absolute pinnacle of my career, completely vindicated by the federal justice system, holding the man of my dreams, and protecting the beautiful new life growing safely inside my body. The terrified girl who had begged for her life on a payphone was gone forever. The brilliant, untouchable woman who had taken her place was finally truly and completely alive. The quiet intimacy of the moment was gently interrupted by a soft, polite knock echoing against the heavy wooden door of the executive suite. Donovan and I slowly turned away from the breathtaking sunset as my personal assistant stepped into the room. She walked quietly across the polished mahogany floor, her heels barely making a sound. She was carrying a small stack of evening briefings, but resting right on top of the neat pile was a single heavily crumpled envelope. It did not belong among the crisp, high-level corporate documents of Vanguard Financial. It was made of cheap, rough beige paper, and it bore the unmistakable sterile ink stamp of the United States Bureau of Prisons. My assistant stopped a respectful distance away and carefully handed me the envelope, offering a silent nod before quietly turning around and leaving the suite. I held the cheap paper in my hand, staring down at the return address. It was from a maximum security federal penitentiary located in upstate New York. The handwriting scrawled across the front was erratic, desperate, and entirely familiar. It was Spencer. Even from behind the thick concrete walls and steel bars of his federal cage, his massive, bruised ego was still desperately trying to reach out and pull me back into his pathetic orbit. He had likely spent weeks writing whatever was inside this envelope. He was probably begging for my forgiveness, demanding an explanation, or pleading for Donovan to somehow use his massive influence to arrange an appeal for his 15-year sentence. Spencer was a man who had spent his entire life manipulating people with his words, and he honestly believed that if he could just get me to read one last letter, he could somehow regain a tiny fraction of his lost control. I stood there for a moment, feeling the rough texture of the prison envelope against my fingertips. 8 years ago, a letter from my husband would have consumed my entire world. I would have torn it open with trembling hands, desperate for any sign of affection or validation. But as I looked at his name written in that frantic, messy ink, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger. There was no triumphant joy. There was only the profound, peaceful silence of total indifference. He was a ghost, and I no longer spoke to the dead. I did not slide my finger under the seal. I did not tear the envelope open. I simply turned around and walked over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting quietly next to my polished mahogany desk. Donovan watched me with a soft, knowing smile, his hands resting casually in his pockets. I held the unopened letter directly over the narrow metal slot. I simply let go. The heavy steel blades instantly roared to life. The sharp mechanical whirring sound filled the silent office as the machine violently pulled the beige envelope downward. In less than 2 seconds, the last desperate words of Spencer William Vance were completely pulverized into thousands of tiny, meaningless strips of paper. The machine gave one final satisfied hum before clicking off, returning the executive suite to a state of absolute perfect peace. I turned back to the massive glass window, taking the hand of Donovan one last time as the final rays of the sun disappeared behind the Manhattan skyline, fade to black. When faced with devastating betrayal and abandonment, the natural human instinct is to react with immediate loud anger. However, Natalie's journey demonstrates that the most effective response to profound injustice is not a chaotic emotional outburst, but rather a calculated commitment to your own personal growth. She was left in the freezing desert with absolutely nothing, yet she chose to turn her deepest trauma into the ultimate fuel for her education and career. She did not seek petty, illegal vengeance. Instead, she acquired specialized knowledge, mastered a highly complex financial system, and built an impenetrable armor of intellectual competence. Conversely, the catastrophic downfall of Spencer and his family serves as a harsh warning about the fragile nature of arrogance. They mistakenly believed that wearing expensive clothes, shouting the loudest, and projecting a fake image of wealth equated to genuine power. But an empire built on a foundation of lies, deceit, and the exploitation of others is essentially a house of cards. It requires constant, exhausting manipulation to sustain, and it only takes one undeniable truth to completely collapse it. The ultimate takeaway is that genuine success does not need to boast. It relies on cold facts, relentless hard work, and unshakable integrity. When you are broken down by the cruelty of others, the greatest victory is not simply destroying your enemies. It is elevating yourself to an untouchable height where their toxic actions can no longer reach you. Justice, when executed with patience and a sharp mind, is absolute.